First of all, Delang Contemporary would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands in which we work, the Wiradjuri Wurrung, Bunurong and the Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nations. And we pay our respects to elders past and present and to the continuation of the cultural, spiritual, educational and artistic practices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It is with very great pleasure to welcome a very familiar face to Delang Contemporary and to our talk series, the very wonderful Dr. John Kean, who has come to us fresh from your whirlwind tour of the Northern Territory, Alice Springs and Papunya. And John, if you don't know already, John is an independent producer, writer and curator who in past lives was the exhibition coordinator at Fremantle Arts Centre, the Thomas Ramsay Science and Humanities Fellow and producer at Melbourne Museum Victoria. But prior to all of this, John was the art advisor at Papunya Toola from 1977 to 1979 and is now the author of the fabulous Dot, Circle and Frame, The Making of Papunya Toola Art. John, thank you so much for being with us today. Yes, and I would like to say, first of all, we do have the books for sale today as well. So John will be here to sign them if you'd like to purchase a book today. So first of all, how was your trip?
It was an amazing trip. I should have brought the slides so I could put them up.
Slideshow, yeah.
And gone on for about 3 hours in the bush.
Yes. So you did launch in Papunya first. So how important was it for you to have a book launch in Papunya?
Yeah, well, having worked with the artists and maintained a relationship with the descendants of the original Papunya painter artists, the people around us now, it was sort of essential to do it the proper way and to take the book to Papunya first and to deliver a gift of meat as well as the book. So we arrived there on sunset. It was, really gratifying to do it. Do the first event at the barbecue at Papunya, and I could hand out some books to those closest people, the senior relatives of the artists, and everybody just clustered around and started flipping the pages. We had all the meat there, big stack of meat, 20 kangaroo tails, steak, sausages, bread, cordial, everything, salads, and people just were flipping through the book. So that was the first great affirmation that it meant something, the book, and it sort of had landed properly. And then we started building up for the principal launch at the Northern Territory Writers' Festival, which was last weekend, and was an ideal setting. So it was at Olive Pink Botanic Gardens, which is sort of just out of town, over the river, on the east side of the river, amongst beautiful kind of rocky outcrops. And the stage was set on the eastern side of an open area. And it so happened there was a full moon last weekend. So the full moon was rising above the stage as people gathered around. The festival itself had opened the night before, but the local Aranda dancers who were booked up for the festival hadn't turned up that night. And the people doing this ceremony or a related ceremony to that one, the possum dancers from Laramba, they were kind of insistent that the local dancers open up. They said, we can't do it without you. So they sought them out and kind of revved up the local dancers, and they came to my event, which is pretty fantastic. So there were, on stage left, there were a whole lot of men with ceremonial hats and spears, and women with leaves and brushes, and they alternately came on the stage, and then the possum people came from stage stage right. And then when they made an appearance, the men came back, the ones with the long hats, with the spears, and they did this sort of threatening dance, a bit like a haka, if you like. So it got a pretty good heightened atmosphere. And then Clifford Possum's grandson, Martin Hagen, was the kind of leader of those dances, and they performed, and then Martin talked about it. Then a bunch of us got on stage, and we couldn't top what had happened before.
We wanted the dancers to come here today.
No, it was a fantastic thing.
And so it was 4 decades ago when you were the advisor at Kaapa Mbitjana Tjampitjinpa, and so the launch of the book this year, over 4 decades, it's a long journey, I suppose. Like, can you just talk a bit about this? I don't like the word journey, but how the book, the realisation of the book in this time.
Yeah, well, as I might have said, you might have heard me in other occasions, I went to Papunya, or Central Australia, when I was pretty young, just finished art school. I was 22. So working with these artists was my formative professional experience, but it was also the way in which I was sort of more formally introduced to the notion of country and the kind of deeper meanings that are in the land, and how the land can be understood, from that place and spreading out from there. So it was formative intellectually, particularly working with people like Clifford Possum, who have such an amazingly confident and sophisticated view of space and how to manifest space. And that was something that really it's informed the rest of my career, say working in exhibitions. Clifford was so confident about, and a lot of the paintings are about spatial representation and manifestation. So getting that kind of background gave me a way to deal with exhibition space, a very kind of palpable way to think about sort of modelling big spaces, or even kind of intellectual constructions within the confines of a gallery space. So that took up, I suppose, the most of my career, working in exhibitions, both with Indigenous artists and all sorts of other disciplines up at the museum.
And so the book is your PhD, which was submitted in 2020. So this was from that. Was it a difficult process converting your PhD into your book?
It was a liberating process, really, because the book was always the intention, and the PhD was the means to get some of my ideas out into the public domain. The PhD got its own kind of shape and purpose, and the time that a PhD demands that you devote to research means that you go to places that you wouldn't usually go. So, and my supervisor, Susan Lowish, always said, you've got 2 PhDs, and if you look at the book, there's, if you look at the side of the book, there's the kind of the white bit, and then is part 1, PhD 1, and then the black bit is the images in between, and the second white bit is the second PhD, second thesis. So I couldn't extricate those 2 things down to make it a more economical and concise argument. I needed both to really find out how these artists, particularly Kaapa and Timlura, and Clifford Possum, came about painting these sorts of works. How do they do it?
Yeah. Well, two PhDs in one is just showing off, really. So, like, you know, like that's fine.
I wasn't awarded 2 PhDs, but...
Well, the chronology of the book, and you just introduced us to that actually now, and has really, well, coming back to this exhibition too. So significant this year, we had to do the catalogue in 2 parts, and John single-handedly contributed to the whole of part 1 because of this incredible collection of boards that we had this year. And it's the first time we've actually split the catalogue and dedicated the 2 halves to the early part, the first 10 years, which is your focus, focusing on the lives of the artists in the first 10 decades of contemporary Indigenous art. And so it kind of aligned so beautifully. So you have said to me that the exhibition and the chronology of the exhibition and how you wrote the first part actually sort of aligns with the book. So did you want to talk us through that? Like, they're all here in this section.
A bit of chronology.
A bit of that, or just,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, chronology's, it's an old-fashioned way to make a narrative, but sort of a handy tool to keep it focused and enable people to travel with you through time as a writer. So I start the book principally in 1928, and there were 2 really big events in Central Australia and the western side of Central Australia in 1928. One was the Coniston massacres, which is a series of massacres that occurred in Amudjara country, just north of where these guys are from. And that changed how Amudjara people were living on the country. That sort of meant that they had to concentrate, in this instance, on Napperby Station, which was experienced as a more safe place to be than Coniston to the north, and some of the neighbouring stations where massacres had occurred. Kaapa was born, he was probably 3 or 4 years old, 2, 3, 4 years old when that event occurred. So that was his background, that dislocation. And the dislocation went as far as people from like old Walter from Kalipimba. They heard stories of the massacres in Amudjara country about 200 kilometres away. So it was an event that sent shockwaves across the country and forms the background to modern Central Australia, at least in that north and western side. The other big event that occurred, and this affects the life of Otto Parolcha, who did the watercolour sort of perpendicular to you, came out of, a lot of people had clustered around Hermannsburg Mission at Nataria, and there was a new missionary there, Pastor Albrecht, and also some committed evangelists like Titus and Moses, and there was an event that sort of precipitated it all. But basically, the missionaries and the evangelists went with the community to a repository of sacred objects called Mananga Nanga, and they had a service there where they made tea and made damper, and they drank tea as I guess the blood of Christ, and the damper is the flesh of Christ. And then the people from the missionaries and the evangelists went up to the repositories in the top of that mountain where the sacred objects were stored, and they brought their objects down. Now, these objects, they belong to the Parolcha family. They, amongst other families, they are thought to be the spirits of the ancestors. So it was a deliberate confrontation between the law of the Churinga, if you like, the old law of maintained and sanctioned and directed by senior men in particular, with the new law of Christ. So it was a really major cataclysmic event that shattered people's sense that they could coexist in this world with Indigenous religion and the new religion. It forced people to go either for the Churinga or for Christ. It was intentionally a very decisive time, and that event sent another set of shockwaves across Central Australia. So I talk about these two events in the book and in the chronology of the exhibition, if you like, because they are important foundational events that affected the minds, the growing up, the experiences, and the fears and anxieties and sense of future of the Wiradjuri artists. That's the background against which these paintings were created. Of course, lots of other things happened in Central Australia. Albert Namatjira was a kind of shining light at Hermannsburg Mission. He was a very capable young man and he could put his hand to anything. What I talk about in the book is that he'd already created artworks before he encountered the watercolour movement. But once he started painting with watercolour on canvas and made such lucid images of Central Australia, which is a kind of amazing mythic, I'm sure you've all seen lots of pictures of it. It's a supercharged visual landscape at any time. He created the visual evidence of that and created a movement. Otto Parolcha and the three, Ruben and Edwin Parolcha, were the three next people who took up the brush and started painting kind of with the materials that Albert Namatjira had taken as his own. He took the brush literally from Rex Batterby and created an art form of his own. They started painting, and then later on Albert's sons and other relatives started painting. So that necessitated a new kind of way of looking at the world, and it's really why I call the book a dot, circle and frame, because to do a painting like that you have to choose what you're looking at. And Albert did it initially, or in 1939 and 38 in particular, through the lens of a Brownie box camera and learning, how to do that on the landscape. So he'd frame up the landscape and choose exactly what to look at. His choice of subjects changed over the years, but he still had to sort of define what he was looking at, and in some instances, maybe he was just going to look at this much. He wasn't going to worry about that site or that site. He was just looking at that one. This new tradition started in Central Australia, and it took its own form, and many artists became famous. Otto Parolcha was really admired from the early days, but particularly in the 50s and in the 60s when I think this work was done, for his kind of abstract forms and for the way that his paintings kind of capture another aspect. If Albert was photographic, Otto was sort of incisive and he sort of cut the surface with these things that could be similar to an adze mark on a wooden plane, if you like. So he took this very stylised form, and in the essay I talk about the relationship of this work to another work that's in Araluen Art Gallery, that the painter Rex Batterby, that was a mentor to these artists, called Totemic Rhythms. So he sort of, Batterby picked up on that notion how even the brush strokes could reflect the kind of rhythms of ceremony, the marks on sacred objects, and the kind of, even the sonic realm of the repetitive sonic realm of ceremony in Central Australia. Totemic Rhythms is exactly the same tree and exactly the same tessellated mountain on this side. So that's a subject. It's effectively one of these, or two of these concentric circles. That tree, I've got no doubt, would be an ancestor. Not just any beautiful old gnarled tree that we might admire for its kind of aesthetic qualities, but a particular tree associated with an ancestor, I think, round Mount Zeal. So the Amudjara brothers, who we're here with in the room, Kaapa, or cousin, and brothers Tim Lura, Clifford Possum and Tim Lura, they were very independent men. They worked on, in the shadow of the Coniston massacres, they worked on a whole lot of cattle stations around Central Australia. They were looking at the land in a new way. They're looking at the land from the saddle of a horse or the seat of a truck. They're moving across it in quite a different way, but they're also incredibly, unlike life on Hermannsburg where ceremonies were suppressed, Amudjara people, as long as you did your work, you could do your own ceremonies. The pastoralists didn't give anything for that. So ceremonial life was maintained around Napperby in a really strong way, and is right now. It persisted in a way that is different to the missions. So they were independent people used to making their own living in the post-war cash economy, and they didn't want to do it like Namatjira, and probably they couldn't, because that's intellectual property in Central Australian terms. How you frame up a picture, how you can conceive of a picture, and the materials that you use can be associated with family lineages and proprietary rights. So these guys, as Clifford told me, preferred to keep in shape, and do their own thing. And they were the kind of brains trust of the Papunya movement as it emerged. There were other artists, like Walter Jambijimba and Timi Jabangadi and Anajari Jakamara, and in the other room, Charlie Taro Jungarai, who pursued painting in a very different way. But this book talks about mainly how these guys went about it, because they went about it in a very deliberate way, and they were very intentional artists, if you like. Do you want to ask me about this painting?
So John, can you tell us about this painting, please? Talk about that painting.
Or maybe somebody's got an interruption or something. Anybody's relation hasn't been talked about?
No, actually, we were going to say, yes, so, well, this painting. So, I mean, last year when we had the talk series with Luke, we had another incredible selection of boards, and I think we were talking about, with every board is a new discovery, and it's another piece of the puzzle as far as, this 71, 72 period, which is, so integral. And so, I mean, is there any, and then this year with this incredible discovery of this Kaapa, which is, an incredible piece of the puzzle, can you please talk about that? And do you think there are any more like this that are possibly out there?
Dylan sent the photo of this painting, both front and back, to me and Luke Scholes simultaneously. We both saw it instantly, but sort of thought that was an amazing painting on the front. But there's one thing written on the back of the painting that's a dead giveaway to what this painting is and where it fits into the chronology. So there's Joe Caddy written on the back of the painting. Joe Caddy was a judge of the Caltex Art Prize in Alice Springs at the golf club in late August 1971. So this painting was painted, when we saw that, we know that Joe Caddy bought the painting on a trip to Alice Springs in 1971. The painting was done before she bought the painting, obviously. So it's of this very small group of works that we know were taken to Alice Springs for that exhibition. So 7 of those works are accounted for. This is the missing one. There may be other works that were painted at that time that went in slightly different directions, but Kaapa chose to bundle 8 paintings together at the behest of District Welfare Officer Jack Cook and send them to him at the Native Affairs branch office in Alice Springs in 1971. This is one of those paintings. So Kaapa was far and away the most sort of ambitious and confident and precise artist painting at Papunya at that time. He was doing something very different to everybody else in Papunya. Maybe there's not a... Yeah, maybe this old Walter could have been painted at the same time. So Kaapa was... I need to talk about his personality because his personality is critical to his agency. Kaapa was a very independently minded person. He was a noted troublemaker who the authorities sort of distrusted because he didn't play by their rules and he wouldn't be subservient and he wasn't honest in European terms in the community at that time. So Kaapa had this kind of free-ranging, he was sitting very close to his country with great authority within the settlement of Papunya, and he would move around with kind of considerable insouciance, I think is a word that literary people use for his bad attitude. So he'd move around and he got hold of the old settlement office there in the heart of Papunya, not far from the school where Geoffrey Barton was working, and the manual training facility where some of these boards were cut. But he got this nice little space away from the wind that built up in the desert in winter, and quite comfortable, and other people clustered around him. That Jack Cook, the district welfare officer, he saw one of Kaapa's paintings that was exhibited in the store, and then made his way over to talk to Kaapa at his studio, and they made an agreement. Jack was very enthusiastic for someone showing such entrepreneurship, and that's when they made the agreement to send some works in. So yeah, it's a particular moment, and it's the moment before there was any recognition of Papunya painting. No Papunya works had gone out, been seen publicly. It was just a little thing that was happening amongst a few men in a limited space. And then these works went into Alice Springs. All of them were sold on the weekend, and because they're so fantastic and so revelatory, if you look there's just so much information to curious white people who are, they're wanting to find out more about Aboriginal painting, Aboriginal culture. Kaapa sort of lays it all out there. So, Kaapa was kind of ahead of the pack in doing these remarkable works. And its story was taken back to by Joe Caddy and given to or sold to the original owner. I think that it feels like there was this sort of feminist movement of women really interested in Aboriginal rights. Certainly the woman who, if someone can put me out of my misery and find the name, it'd be good. She was well known for advocacy on Aboriginal issues in Adelaide, but she put it up high in a stairwell, beyond touch, beyond probably much light, and beyond people's regular vision. So,
John, did you want to look at the book?
That's not in the book. It's in the black one.
Oh, that one.
Yeah. Margaret King Bowes, respect. She was a fantastic woman. But it seems like it was, there was something happening in Adelaide between these women that probably deserves its own story. But when she passed away, it came through her daughter's, her estate to her daughter and somehow to Delan, and then we saw it. So could I talk about the painting a little bit? Up close?
Please, yes.
It is one of those paintings you can look at just and find more and more and more. At a material level, there's that board, a piece of masonite, probably a new piece of structure for the settlement at Papunya that was sort of siphoned off somehow to Kaapa. And then there's the paints. There's the neighbouring board from the Wilkerson collection has some chalk on it. It's chalk, so maybe it was a blackboard. There was a school really close by, so maybe there was a blackboard. And so that's kind of another remnant. And it's an earlier work, I think, because it's got some underpainting. But this one, it looks like maybe blackboard paint, that really lovely matte feeling. And then Kaapa's got other materials, including a poster paint for these he's got really beautiful brushes, fine watercolour brushes, maybe from one of the Kean Namatjira, who he was friends with, or Richard Mokatarinja, or maybe he's pinched the brush from the school. He's known to have done that. And so painted with these sort of gouache things, very fine elements. And then he's also got some ochre, yellow ochre, and down here it looks like there's a bit of red ochre mixed in with the paint. We haven't done the chemical analysis, so it could be poster paint, but looks like ochre. And then to top it all off, he's done some little highlights with watercolour paint that he's probably got from his Aranda friends, like Kean Namatjira. So if you look at the little figure, or a magnificent figure, the emu feathers or maybe leaves that he's shaking in both hands are highlighted with a green watercolour. And so the same with the tufts at the top of this ceremonial pole. So he's sort of used this sort of rare, valuable, kind of unusual material for the visual shaky bits in the painting. So then to the configuration. Kaapa, these guys, they were in the modern world, first thing. They were in the modern world. They used to go to church, maybe Kaapa not so much. They used to read comics, Phantom, cowboy comics, all that kind of stuff. So they were aware of the kind of flow of imagery And they're also into ethnographic books of Central Australia. So they were looking at books like Spencer and Gillen that showed ceremonial figures on the ceremonial ground. And that's what Kaapa chose to do. He was thinking about his ceremony. And there's a very good chance that he was thinking about it from a first person perspective, that this could be Kaapa. I like to think of, there's a few paintings where there's a figure at this kind of penultimate moment in the ceremony where the key figures dance towards a ground painting and is kneeling right there at the ground painting, just before everything's finished. His body's covered with, or he's painted with a kind of a belt across here, marks on there, and across his face. And he's got probably an object made of twigs that's bound with hair string across his head. And then there's fluff applied to his body, which may be chopped up eagle down, or it could be womble, like chopped up daisy fluff. So that sort of hides his individual identity, and he's there. You can't see his eyes. He can see you, but you can't see his eyes. So he's probably talking about rainbow serpents that travel to a place where he was grown up, 20 Mile Bore, 12 from 20 miles east of Napabi, but also thinking about his father's country at Mikantji, which is the sort of water dreaming symbol over there. So these are another set of ground paintings. A ceremonial pole that Kaapa used to compare with telegraph poles, because these poles kind of emit signs, information, fertility to the surrounding country. So that's probably enough on that painting.
Oh, no. I'm sure, yes.
It's amazing painting.
It's an amazing, and
Yeah.
like,
Let's ask a
yeah.
question.
Sure.
What strikes me when you talk about that, it struck me when I read your book, I've actually read the book,
Yeah, one reader.
is that you really talk about this work like a painter. Someone who's been trained in looking at painting. I think that, and that really distinguishes, I think, the way you write about the movement, from the other equally great books, by so many people. And I just wondered if you could talk a bit about that, because that really fascinated me in reading the book, and the way, and you're nodding for you too.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm
really
agreeing.
fascinated me, your account of
Yeah.
the movement. It's like from someone who has an instinctive sense of how paintings work, just painting universal ideas of how paintings work.
Well, they are paintings. They have to be made. So I like to think about them as how someone is going to make something. There's that very utilitarian part of painting it's about getting the right materials. In Kaapa's instance, walking around the settlement, getting all these odd bits from different places, and how a work is conceived. So I trained as a painter and a printmaker in Gippsland before going to Central Australia, and had, like all art students, aspirations, but they were instantly quashed when I was amongst these artists, and they spoke to me instantly. In fact, I'd seen there's this little exhibition called the Peter Stuyvesant exhibition of travelling Papunya paintings or something like that, and it went all around 35 venues around Australia to university and college venues, and it contained some of the most amazing works. One by Kaapa of wind barnacle serpents that I was struck by. How is this conceived? So I was pre-primed before I went to Central Australia sort of be thinking about these works. And then I guess my first job for Papunya Chula artists, a few months after I arrived, was sitting in a room, smaller than this room, and doing, those old paintings that have the annotations. They have drawings of the work done with those old repeatograph pens, those architects' pens. They're very finely done, beautiful little drawings. I got a job to draw all the paintings in the room. So there were several hundred paintings that I sat down and looked at how they were constructed. So I suppose from the first instance, even before I was sort of engaged with commissioning artists, I was thinking about how are these works constructed. And to turn to Clifford's work, how is it that a painting that was created in the 1970s by an ex-stockman on the living at a remote Aboriginal community, how does it look so similar to what's was being sold in galleries in Melbourne and Sydney and Adelaide? If you remember, some of you, a couple of people my age might remember Gallery A and that Baillieu Gallery, Realities Gallery, and those sorts of places where the colourfield painters were doing paintings that were not too dissimilar, those sorts of patches and the kind of flatness, the overall flatness of the work was what was going on at that time. But these artists seem to come at it through a very different, from a different tangent, or hit it at a different tangent. And that just absolutely preoccupied my mind, is how did they do it, What does this convergence mean? Is there some, white fella out there mucking with their brain and making them paint like this? Or, because these artists didn't have an exposure to the gallery system at that time. Even Clifford had never been to a southern gallery when he painted that work.
Yeah. No, actually, I was going to bring me to my last question, just before, and then we might open some questions up to the floor. But that, like, these works, were all painted at this time of like great exploration. The artists were just in this incredible, time of great exploration, but without any influence. There were no art advisors. Yeah. There was no market influence, nothing like that. But in particular, the interregnum, is that how, which I find is a fascinating word anyway, as well as, I'm amazed I said it properly. But that period where this attributed painting to Timi Payunga and also this Anajari here were painted in that period. Can you just briefly talk about this particular period and what happened?
The interregnum, I think that's the time between two other times. The time that's joining two other times. Clifford always used to talk about times that in terms of artists, the art advisors, Jeff Barton time, Jeff been go, he'd say. Jeff went with a breakdown. And then Peter Fannin time, Peter Fannin been go. Same thing happened to him, poor thing. And then Janet Wilson time, who's a regular at this gallery. She chose to go, and me too. I chose. We all go. So anyway, the interregnum is the time after Jeff Barton, the teacher often associated with kind of facilitating the movement at Papunya, and some of those ideas I contest in the book, but that's another thing. So Jeff went suddenly. And then there were materials, and people were working in that old Nissen hut. You will have seen the photos of the old Nissen hut. But there was no regular contact with white fellas. There was irregular contact with people coming and buying works like this. And I think this one moved out independently too. Mm-hmm. But there was no one buying for, Jeff was at the settlement intermittently, even in the mid-1972, and it wasn't until December when Peter got the job officially. That's the interregnum. There was a lot of materials around because people were keen to support the painters. So there was all these fantastic materials coming along, but the artists just did their own thing. They riffed with all of these amazing ideas for those months. And then at the end of the year, those works were collected up into what remained of them into consignment 18, jumbled all together, you know, like a pack of cards being totally shuffled and then given numbers. So the only way to think through what happened there, because there's no real living witnesses to the detail of what happened, is to look at the stylistic relationships and take that kind of real art historical formalist approach to you know, art analysis. See who were related, where the trends were going, who picked them up. And then there are just total anomalous works like this one, I believe, by Timmy Jabangati, that has elements that sort of link it into that time but is its own thing entirely. So people produced very, very unique works. And it was the moment where sort of everything shattered and went out and reached its possibilities in a way. And then in some senses, you know, what went on to become Papunya Chula art after that time, the art of dot and circle, contracted back from that those few months where the artists explored very radically, and they did you know, like imbrications, like little crescents covering the board instead of dots. Sure.
Just a question.
Yep.
Did the women's Utopia batik movement have any influence on this sort of stylisation?
But the women's batik movement is a little bit later on. I think it started, maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, there's a couple of art historians in the room, in 1976 or maybe 77. Yeah, so this is just a few years before. But it's another...
I'm just wondering if there was a crossover at any stage.
No, I think there are some really interesting crossovers because, you know, if you think about a Madura country, it's like a sausage above Alice Springs area or above the McDonnell Ranges, and it goes from just where Papunya is, but a bit north, right over to Utopia, where the batik started. So there are cultural links and transmissions of ideas across that way that I believe had a big effect on how painting evolved in Utopia later. But at this moment, no, they were making, I think men were making shields. I don't think there was a woman's craft activity or business or practice other than the body, other than body paint and all of that.
We might have time for one or more question or two more questions. Does anyone have any questions for John? Yeah.
You have the one canvas. Is all the rest done on wood?
On materials, it's watercolour paper and masonite. And that's another way of dating paintings, is by what they're painting on. Is that masonite, I think? Some are on very thin composite wood, like fibre board, that kind of thing, but not like MDF. Before MDF, it's quite open, so it absorbs the paint quite nicely. Yeah, like here you can see that chips on the corner there. It's quite a fragile medium that sometimes degrades. And then in 1974, I think, there had been a couple of canvases before, but 1974 was when the canvas started, and under Peter Fannon's guidance, but also the direction at the Aboriginal Arts Board of Tim Lura. He said in the Aboriginal Arts Board, we don't want handout. We want to earn our money. Why don't you buy some paintings? We'll paint them. You buy them. So there's these great Aboriginal Arts Board collections out there that came out of Tim's urgings. And yeah, from that time, 74, when there was a market available, the canvases came. Originally it was cotton canvas, and then later Belgian linen. So there's a painting, fantastic painting that I'd encourage you to look at down the end, painted by Charlie Taro Jungarai. That's painted, must have been at a time where we either couldn't get canvas, couldn't get linen, or the company didn't have any money to buy linen, so we bought cheaper canvas. Yeah, have a look at that one. It's got some other materials on there. I was looking at it before. It's got original Mount Liebig, Julpulguna, bird shit. It's still on. It's been exported to the States and lived in Los Angeles for a few years, but the stamp of being painted in the bush still persists, and quite a lot of other detritus on the material. So, as I stretch that canvas and remember doing it, it's lovely to look how it was painted, in that kind of very direct sense on the side of a big mountain.
And what about the canvas boards?
Oh yeah, canvas boards. Canvas boards, there's another Charlie Tyrrell one inside the office area there. I think they came about the same time. So they're another good way to date the works, generally 74, 75, they start to emerge. Yeah, and they were kind of these smaller works there. The Papunya painting sort of came from the tourist trade, and for many years there were big commissions by the Aboriginal Arts Board for groups of paintings, but the greatest number of works were produced and sold locally, suitcase size boards that people could purchase and carry with them on their trip. So there's a place called Centre for Aboriginal Artists and Craftsmen, and it was, when I was there, it was managed by Daphne Williams, who later became a kind of long-term Papunya Chula stalwart, and the person who sort of grew up the company to be pretty solid. Yeah, she really did her best to market these works, so there was a fairly constant supply of income to artists. Small, but at least constant.
Chris?
This might be a little bit off the beaten track, but
Yep.
When one thinks about the coordinators,
Yep.
one of the most interesting characters, and to me is very shadowy, is Dick Kimber.
Oh, yeah.
So have you got any recollections that can shed light on
Dick?
Because he's so extraordinary in his photographs, and
Yep.
have a brief conversation. He went, this bloke's the real bushy deal, wasn't he?
Yeah, well, Dick's still alive.
Yeah, someone said that.
Yeah, he was at my book launch on Friday. He's, respects to Dick, he's my mentor. He's got very bad Parkinson's disease, so he can't speak, but he can hear everything. So yeah, Dick he's really the only kind of living witness to a lot of events in those very early years. He was a school teacher who went to Central Australia in, I think, 1969 or 1970, and he's a particular kind of fella. He's a sober fella. He doesn't drink, but he likes a cup of tea and teddy bear biscuits. And he played footy until he was 49 or something. He's an amazing bloke. Anyway, he spent his youth at the South Australian Museum poring over the racks of objects, and he reckons at that stage he kind of read everything that was written about Aboriginal culture, if that were possible even then. And he sort of had a particular role with Papunya Chula of providing advice and kind of filling in at various times. He was never a full-time art advisor, but he was he was like when I was there, he supervised me for the first period when I was working, and there'd be a little handwritten note every day in this incredibly fine school teacher's writing, saying just a brief note, and then with the points that I was to keep my attention on that particular day. Anyway, yeah, Dick's amazing. He's a waddy. You know, he went through initiation with Walbury people, with you know, guided by some other Jacamarra men, Michael Nelson's older brother, Harry Nelson, and those sorts of people.
So would he have gone to the highest levels of white Australians in that initiation and up the, you know, the...
I can't say. I don't know. I don't know what he knows.
Yeah.
His diaries, that aspect of his journals can't. They're not publicly available. I haven't seen them.
It's not kosher for him to talk about it.
No, he wouldn't talk about that stuff. No. Yeah. But he's a fascinating character.
I would suspect.
We're just waiting for a really good archivist to put together his journals that would make it one of the best social histories of Central Australia in the 20th century, I think.
Is that your next job?
No, I'm not a good archivist.
Well, we might wrap it up there,
Okay,
only because
thanks,
we could talk forever.
Yeah.
But thank you so much, John. Honestly, you've been always so generous with your knowledge and so generous to us here at Deland Contemporary. You always contribute to our catalogues. Particularly this year, you know, really, yeah, thank you so much. And
Pleasure.
we, you know, really big heartfelt congratulations on the book. It's an incredible contribution to Australian art history, and we're just, yeah, really thrilled for you. So join me in thanking John. Thank you so much.
Thank you.